All right, folks, welcome back again tonight to our study of the book of Revelation, and we are going to be looking at the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, looking at what's called the dragon in this 12th chapter. I'll just kind of remind you that everything that we see in the book of Revelation from the 4th chapter and going forward, John sees through an open door into heaven, and so it's this heavenly vision, and as he looks, we're going to see that he sees a dragon. Now, I want to read to you just a little bit of the first part of this chapter, verses 1 through 6. So if you've got your Bible and you kind of want to follow along. It says, "There was a great sign that appeared in heaven, and a woman was clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads, and its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born." Very grim picture there, huh? "She gave birth to a son, a male child, who," it says this, "will rule all the nations with an iron scepter." And you'll notice in the Bible it puts that statement in quotation marks. And that's because it is a quotation from the Old Testament. "And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. All right, what in the world is going on in this passage? Well, what I want us to do today is a little bit different than the way we've been kind of covering this. I've kind of just been teaching through it, but today I want you to kind of get a sense of the drama of this 12th chapter. In some ways, this 12th chapter is a key to the entire book of Revelation. And so what I want to do is just kind of walk through it, but try to keep in our minds some questions like, what is John seeing, and what does it mean, and what are the clues to help us understand what could be being talked about? Well, the first thing that John sees is what I would call it the devouring dragon, and trying to figure out what this is and what this means is a little bit of what we're talking about. Well, to help us understand this, we're told that there were 2 signs. And the first sign, or the sign number 1, is a woman. And we're told some things about her. You know, she's clothed with the sun, the moon's under her feet, there's a crown of 12 stars on her head. I don't know if you know it or not, but that's a kind of a traditional Jewish symbol for the nation of Israel. It's not an unusual thing in Scripture or in history to think of Israel in that way. And so that's sort of a little bit of an indication, but we're not really told all of that yet. We're just sort of left to wonder, who is she and what does it mean? Well, then he sees another sign, and in verse 3, it is this devouring dragon. And we're told that this dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, and with its tail, it sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky, flings them to the earth, stands in front of the woman who's about to give birth to a child, and then wants to devour the child the moment that it's born. So what's going on here? What's happening in this story? I want us to think about that. I want us to try to figure out, like, what is this really weird thing that's taking place? Well, one clue in all of this that's pretty clear is that this child is described as having an iron scepter. You know, before I make that point, though, let me just quickly show you this. This is, and I love to show these as we go through the book of Revelation, these paintings, these wood carvings by the famous artist Albert Dürer. This is a scene of kind of like the dragon over here. You can see another one where he's Michael the archangel's fighting with the dragon. That's kind of a picture of what the scene might have looked like in John's vision. But the description that we have here is that there is a child who has an iron scepter. If you were to go back and read in the Psalms, for example, the 2nd Psalm, the Messianic Psalm, it talks about a child that's born. He's the anointed one. In Hebrew, he's the Messiah. That great messianic psalm. In verse 9 of that psalm, it says this. It says that you will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. That's a picturesque image of power, right? Rulers in the ancient world, one of the signs of their kingly royal authority was they would have a scepter. But to have an iron scepter implied strength. This was a time, in history where not everybody had iron, and so to have an iron scepter, that was really strong and powerful. And so the idea you could just dash, pottery to pieces. He's going to rule with great power and authority. Well, this psalm is actually frequently quoted in the New Testament or alluded to in many different ways and places, and it is a messianic type of psalm. So that helps us kind of figure out who this child is. Then we're told that he's taken to heaven. Right before he's about to be devoured, he's taken up to heaven, and that kind of makes us wonder, what's happening there. And of course, we do have a story in the New Testament about Jesus, being taken to heaven, and so maybe that's helpful. Now, all of that's being described, and then all of a sudden, the scene changes. And what I want us to kind of do right now is to kind of think a little bit about, we're trying to understand something in the Bible. We're trying to understand something in the book of Revelation. Well, that was 2,000 years ago, and we don't live in that world, right? We live in America 2,000 years later, and our world's always changing and so on. But that ancient world, they had some images and some ideas in their mind that if you just referred to them, they immediately knew what you were talking about. And so I want us to think a little bit in the background of what was happening in that culture and world to help us kind of get an idea of that. And what I want us to do is to think about this in our world today. We have stories that are part of our culture that we can instantly identify with. Take, for example, the story of the Lion King, right? The Lion King. The 1994 Disney film that was recently redone was an American animated epic music drama. It was the story of the tragic murder of a king. And of course, it's the lion in the story, which leads to his son's escape, grows up in a wilderness, returns, defeating the evil false king, and reclaims his throne as the rightful king. This is the story, the Lion King. Why am I bringing that up? Well, because this is a story that we know this kind of storyline. And so when the readers of Revelation, the churches of Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira, when they're reading this, they're hearing this description, in their mind, they think of, oh, I know that story. Now, they haven't seen the Lion King movie, right? But they have another story that everyone has grown up with. The stories of the ancient world are called mythology, and they were the movies of the ancient world. And there was a story that lay in the background of all of this, related to the most famous, or maybe the most famous, probably the most famous, of the Greek gods, named Apollo. In Greek culture, Apollo was much revered. He had a famous oracle at a place called Delphi. And to talk about Apollo was to talk about the pride of Greek culture in much of that part of the world. But there was a story, a famous story that everyone knew about Apollo's childhood. In Greek mythology, he's the son of Zeus, and his mother was a woman named Leto. And the story goes that she was pregnant with Apollo, and kind of show you the picture of this scene from the Greek mythology books. She's pregnant with Apollo when a famous dragon, you can see kind of here. I'm sorry that the picture's so pixelated. I couldn't find a better version of it, but this snake, this called python, which is also referred to in the literature as a dragon, tried to kill the boy when it was born. But there's a story in Greek mythology where he's taken to an island and he's kept safe by Zeus, and that Poseidon hides him under the ocean. And when the boy's finally born, he goes back and he avenges his mother, who's killed, and the dragon by killing the dragon python. In other words, when these readers were hearing this story, like our culture that could think of something like the Lion King, they knew that story. And it seems that what we're hearing here is a famous story of a child who is endangered, whose mother is threatened or dies, but whose son comes back and avenges, right? That's the story of the Lion King. That's the story of Python of the Greeks. Well, in the book of Revelation, what's happening here is this symbolism is being used to tell a familiar kind of story. Now, to help you kind of understand this, it's always important to remember to think genre. The Bible is not just a book, it's 66 books. Some parts of it are narrative, some parts of it are poetry, some parts of it are parable, some parts of it are letters. Well, this is a section in Revelation that was called apocalyptic. And in the apocalyptic literature, they use symbolism, rich symbolism, to try to tell a story, to try to get a message across. That's what I'm trying to tell you is happening here. We can just take this for a second and just talk about genre. If I told you I was watching a movie with a horse, a cowboy, and a gunfight in the Old West, what kind of movie am I watching? I'm watching a Western, right? I mean, you know that. If I said this movie's got Adam Sandler in it and everyone's laughing, what kind of movie is that? It's a comedy, right? In other words, we can pick up on things right away. If I'm saying I'm watching a show on TV, it's right before dinner or maybe right after dinner, and there's a bunch of contestants spinning a wheel trying to make money, guessing letters on the screen, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Wheel of Fortune. What kind of show is that? It's a game show. We know genre. I just give you little clues, and you can go, oh, I know what that is. Well, this is what's happening here in Revelation, is that they're given subtle clues. They know the story, and they know how the story is going to end. They understand what's being done here. So why don't we take it apart and figure out what's going on here? So first of all, we'll ask the question, who is this woman, or who is she? Scholars have speculated through the years different possible answers to who this woman is. I mean, here's this woman, right? I told you about the stars and all this other kind of stuff about her. She's about to have a son, and the dragon's trying to devour the son. Who is she? Well, I mean, it's easy for us to realize that this child has something to do with Jesus, and so people have said maybe it's Mary, right? Mary gives birth to Jesus. That's the Christmas story. And in one version of Christianity in the world today, Catholicism, Mary is highly venerated. So is it Mary being talked about here? Well, actually, in truth, Mary was not highly venerated in the early church. And so this is not describing Mary. Is it Israel? I told you, I was like, some of the symbolism there kind of sounds a lot like Israel. Or is it the church? Well, she's actually unnamed in the passage, and it seems like what's being described here is that she is that she is representative of God's people. Israel, after all, as a nation, was the one that gave us the Messiah, right? Jesus said that salvation comes from the Jews, and so the Jewish nation does help give us the Messiah, of course, who is born by Mary. And so that's helpful in trying to figure out what's going on. Now, I'm teasing this out a little bit as we're going through this, and so let me just tell you this. Then suddenly the scene changes, and I want you to read what happens in verses 7, 8, 9. War broke out in heaven, okay? Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough. They lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down. The ancient serpent, called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray, was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. All right, so in this passage, the questions that I just thought, who is this? What is this? Are starting to be answered. The mysteries are starting to be revealed. And this devouring dragon, we discover, is also the devilish dragon, if you will. I'm trying to keep the alliteration going so you'll stay interested, all right? So the scene changes again, all right? We're going from a kid's movie, The Lion King, right? We're going from that kind of a story, the story of Python and and Apollo, kind of a story where a little child avenges his mother, to a story of war. This is now a war movie, all right? There is a battle going on. And who would God want more to be leading his army than Michael, right? That's the person described here, or actually the angel that's described here. Michael, in Jewish tradition, was the protector angel for Israel. Michael was the angel in Jewish literature that protects God's people. And you say, well, where do you get that from? Well, not from this picture, although it's helpful for us to think about, but we get it from this passage. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 says, at that time, this is the Old Testament, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. Okay, well, that's where it comes from. In the Old Testament, Daniel the prophet describes Michael as the protector of the people. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. But that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. We also read about Daniel. Actually, before I get to that slide, I want to tell you about another passage, and I don't have it on the screen, but in the book of Jude, there's no chapters in Jude, just verses, because it's just one chapter. Jude 9, it says, even the archangel Michael, when he was disputing with the devil about the body of Moses, did not himself dare to condemn him for slander, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Just referring to you the fact that the New Testament also tells us about Michael and also refers to him as the archangel. And he's in this war scene. So Michael's coming, the great warring angel, and he's fighting against the dragon. Now the question is, why is the dragon, or put another way, why is the devil being portrayed as a dragon at all? And we actually see this kind of thing in the Old Testament. For example, sometimes in the Old Testament, there is what's called we might call a sea dragon. I'll quote to you from the prophet Isaiah, the 27th chapter. It says, on that day the Lord, with his cruel, great, and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will kill, look at the translation, the dragon that's in the sea. Now you may say, I didn't know the Bible said that. But yeah, there's a dragon in the sea in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. He's even given a name. He's called Leviathan. Now here the dragon in this passage is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. And horns are often a symbol of power in Jewish symbolism. And obviously having 7 heads is kind of a mockery of, of God. Well, these 7 describe to us here that this is a very powerful, very, very powerful creature that's being described. We read about this 10-headed beast in the book of Daniel. Where we read about a 10-headed beast back in the book of Daniel in the 7th chapter, in verse 7, it says, after that, in my vision, at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It which kind of terrifying to think about, right? It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts because it had 10 horns. So just this symbolism, just kind of quoting that to you, is very much in the Scriptures. So who is this? Who is this dragon? I mean, by now you've kind of figured that out, but the passage tells us really 3 different things about him. It gives him 3 different names. For one, the passage tells us he is the ancient serpent that leads the whole world astray and is thus the deceiver. Now, if you think about it, that ancient serpent, I mean, what serpent is really, really old? Well, the oldest serpent in the Bible goes all the way back to Genesis, the very beginning. And we read about in Genesis chapter 3, remember Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit when the serpent convinces them to do that ancient serpent. Look at what it says in Genesis 3:13. The Lord said to the woman, "What is this you've done?" This is, you're talking to Eve. The woman said, "The serpent," what's the word? "Deceived me." The ancient deceiver, the ancient serpent. One of the tasks of the dragon has always been, from Genesis, he is the deceiver of God's people. He tells us, eat the fruit, it's okay, it's good. And then you see what happens. He's given another name. He is called, in this passage, the Satan. In Hebrew, Revelation wasn't written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek, but in Hebrew that word is Hasatan. And we read about it in the Old Testament. For example, Job famously has a scene in Job where we're taken kind of into God's heavenly court, and God's on his throne, and there are these other angels and beings there in his presence. And there is one who is going out around the world, finding stuff wrong with people, and coming before God's court and saying, hey, look at this person. And the one that the accuser, that's what Hasatan means, points out to God is Job. And in Job 1:9, God asks Satan, the Hasatan, about Job, and Satan says famously, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" In other words, the only reason Job fears you is because you give him so much stuff. And so what he does is he begins to accuse. He's always the accuser of the brethren. That's one of his famous titles in the Bible. Well, we see him also in the prophet Zechariah. The 3rd chapter of the book of Zechariah is also a court scene, and God's people are also on trial. And in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right side," and catch this, "to accuse him." It's a court scene, right? This guy, Satan's there. Satan's job is he's the finger pointer, right? He's the one pointing his finger, going, look what they did wrong. Well, it's interesting if you go back and read that scene in Zechariah. God actually exonerates the high priest, and what we find in the New Testament is that God does that for us. There's a word it's used in the book of Romans. It's called justification. And what God does is he invites us into his courtroom. The accuser accuses us, but God says, you know what? I look to my son and his sacrifice, and you are now forgiven, and you're now right in my eyes. It's theologians call this God's imputed righteousness has been given to you. All right, so that's 2 of the titles. The 3rd title is that in this passage he is called the slanderer. This is a word that can mean blaspheme. Kataleo in Greek almost literally means to kill with words. That one of the things that the accuser does, the deceiver does, the serpent does, the dragon does, as he mows you down with blasphemous words of slander. Well, we see that in 1 Peter. The Christians were encouraged to look out for the devil. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion." He's looking for someone to devour. That's what he's doing. He's just looking around for that. So be aware of that. All right, well, let's get back to the text. In verse 10, I want to read to you what happens next, so we can finish all of our questions and put all this together. In verse 10 it says, "Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers,'" there's his name, the accuser, the dragon, "the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before God day and night," never stops pointing his finger at you, going, look what you did, "has been hurled down. They," God's people, "triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He's filled with fury, because he knows his time is short." Now when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman, who I told you before, that's God's people, the picture of God's people. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle. I think of the eagle as being that which has incredible wings. To me, I think here in this moment of the Lord of the Rings. If you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings novels, you know, the eagles are coming, and they always rescue everything. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. By the way, that corresponds to the 1,260 days. Out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Now, I just kind of want to remind you that as this book of Revelation was written, it was written at a time, either during the time or just after the time of the great Neronian persecution, under which many Christians died, including Peter and Paul. And so this was a time of incredible death and bloodshed and Christians dying. And now under Domitian, this other later emperor, even more Christians are suffering. And in a lot of ways, they were asking this question, how do you defeat him? How do you defeat the dragon? How do you get through all of this? And so that's where I want us to look at here in this third section on defeating the dragon. So to do that, let's do what we've been doing, which is kind of take it apart. So first of all, in our lives, our war with the dragon, it's a struggle, isn't it? It's a war. I grew up at a time when leaders of our country declared a war on drugs, We sometimes call it a war on crime. After 9/11, we had a war on terrorism. Well, Christians in that period of time were living in a period where there was a war on Christ, and there was a war on Christians, and there was persecution. Now, we don't always deal with the kind of persecution in the United States or in the Western world like they did among those early Christians, or like they do in countries like Iran, some parts of China, and so forth, North Korea. I mean, we know there are countries that persecute Christians. We see in the news China tearing down crosses and closing down churches. We know that there is a war on Christians. But there's also a more subtle war on Christianity. There always is, and there always has been, and we've got to pay attention to that as well, because listen to what the apostle said in the book of Ephesians. He said, our war, our struggle, is not against people. It's not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, and against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. Well, if you're fighting a spiritual battle, how do you win that? How do you defeat the dragon? Well, in this passage, there's only one thing that defeats the dragon. And we're told in this passage, it is by the blood of the Lamb, which takes us all the way back to the 5th chapter of the book of Revelation. In a way, our solution has already been presented to us. In the 5th chapter, he says, then I saw a lamb looking as if it has been slain. Verses 8 and 9, he says, and when it had been taken, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, fell down before the Lamb, and they sang a new song. You're worthy to take the scroll because you were slain. With your blood, you purchased men for God from every tribe and language and nation. And then in verse 12 it says, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. And then it says in chapter 12, verse 11, they overcame him. This is what it says in this passage. By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. That's how they defeated the dragon. They overcame him. Doesn't mean that they didn't die. I mean, these Christians died. But they overcame. That's what's amazing in the book of Revelation is that victory is not getting out alive. Victory is holding fast with your testimony, even in the face of persecution. The dragon can unleash everything against you, but you beat him by fighting the spiritual battle, by holding on to the blood of the Lamb and the witness of your testimony. Put another way, we overcome him through the cross. This reminds me of what Paul says in Colossians 2:15. It says that, and having disarmed the powers and authority, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Think of that. The death of Jesus on the cross, to the early followers, Peter and all the rest of them, they thought Jesus was defeated. They ran, they hid. The religious leaders who had sent him over to the Romans to have him killed, they thought, victory, we've beaten him, we win. Jesus is defeated. But according to Paul in Colossians 2:15, that it was at the cross that he triumphed. That it was at the cross he won. It was at the cross he achieved his victory. You got to think that that is a completely upside down view of everything, isn't it? That the way that God would achieve his victory was that Jesus maintained his testimony. He maintained his ministry even to the point of death and through the point of death. And God's called us to that patient endurance. Put another way, it is a victory despite human frailty, weakness. Paul puts it like this in 2 Corinthians. Remember he asked God 3 times, take away my thorn in the flesh. You know, people always wonder what that is. God's response is, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. What's Paul saying there? He's saying, look, it's not my strength, not my power, but it's his. Am I weak? Yeah, I'm weak. In my humanness, I'm weak. But God's grace is sufficient, and his power is perfected in that. Paul put it like this in 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Think about that. God's weakness is stronger than man's strength. And that's what we see, is that God's wisdom is that the way to victory is through what seems like defeat. It's through death. And the result of it is that they become what we call martyrs. The word martyr means literally a person who witnesses in a court of law, but it came to refer to people who were willing to hold on to what they had experienced as true about Jesus, even if they were thrown to lions, even if they were killed in the Colosseums of the Roman Empire. And that's, in a sense, what it means in this book to be an overcomer. That image comes out of the Greek games. Overcoming and enduring are not only the symbols of the Christian life, they were important symbols in Greek culture. Paul and many Christian authors of the New Testament used images from the Greek games to talk about the Christian life. In 1896, the Olympic Games restarted after 1,500 years in which they were not done. In 2004, they were held in Athens, Greece. As we watched, we would think about those Greek Olympic Games as they happened 2,000 years ago. But we also think, as we think about things like the Olympics, we think of the Olympic feats that we're called to in the Christian life. And that most important one, the way you defeat the dragon, is endurance. You just keep on running. All right. That's our understanding about the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation. And your homework assignment is to read a lot of the rest of the book. So next time we're going to talk about Revelation 13 through 19. And we're going to talk about beasts and bowls and Babylon. So I'll see you then.